Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture on chapter 5, which is health risks of obesity and physical inactivity. Mostly we're focusing on obesity, but I think the two of them obviously go hand in hand. Okay, so just to start, the first learning outcome outline the global prevalence of, right, the medical conditions associated with and the concepts related to obesity and physical inactivity. And really, we'll talk more about those medical conditions a little bit later on in the chapter. Okay, so first, in terms of kind of what obesity is defined as, so by the World Health Organization, abnormal or excessive fat accumulation that may impair health. Okay, so that's that definition as given by the World Health Organization. If we talk about the prevalence of obesity in the United States, there's a figure, a map that kind of shows you a little bit more information about this, and we'll see it in a second. But the prevalence has increased over the past 20 years. According to, statistics, let me see where this was pulled from. Yeah, so this is pulled from, I think, in 2014. More than 33% of adults are obese and 17% of children, right? So those are pretty high rates. In terms of costs related to adolescent overweight and obesity, it's estimated to be about $254 billion in terms of healthcare costs, in health issues that are associated with obesity in adolescents. And psychosocial aspects and all of those things kind of put together. Okay, so again, this was pulled from a study in 2014. If you look at a map here showing you the prevalence rates and kind of where they're located in the United States, you can check this out here. So in blue, 30 to 35%, right? Less than 20% in red here. Orange, greater than 35%. Okay, and so you can kind of take a look at that distribution and I guess think a little bit about kind of why you see higher rates or why you think you may see higher rates in areas where it's showing you here, West Virginia, Arkansas, Missouri, right? And why you see much lower rates if you're looking at California versus in Colorado here, really low rates in DC and Vermont and Massachusetts. Okay, so maybe just take a minute to kind of think about why you see this sort of geographic distribution in terms of difference in prevalence rates of obesity. Okay, so again, just kind of continuing on with just sort of overview of what we're going to talk about in this chapter. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these as we get later on in the chapter. So some of the diseases that obesity contributes to, right? Diabetes, big ones, such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, even cancers, arthritis, disability, gallbladder disease, acute pancreatitis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, pulmonary complications, and then also, like I said, there's psychological aspects of obesity, and you can say that obesity contributes to depression. Okay, we've been kind of talking about this Healthy People 2020 in a couple of the chapters, right? And so this is now particularly, all right, let's look at these sort of guidelines in place from Healthy People 2020 that are focused on nutrition and weight status, right? So some of the goals of this, within this realm here, promote health, right? Reduce risk of chronic disease. And how could we do that, right? Encourage healthful diet, provide support, right, for achievement and maintenance of healthy body weight. If there are, behavioral, environmental, political factors that are promoting or contributing to obesity, you need to address those as well. Okay. And so this is showing you here. Oh, one other thing I just want to point out before I forget, right. In a lot of these slides in the notes, I've written some things in the notes, and I'll probably pull, kind of go back and just look at them, but just so you guys know that they're there when you're looking at the PowerPoint, right? So sometimes it's a question you might want to think about here, or sometimes it's definitions of some of the words that are on the slide. So just make sure you take a look at that. So here I said, what are some ways you can address the objective categories that are listed, right? So it's showing you here, these are objective categories. Healthcare and work site settings, weight status, food insecurity, food and nutrient consumption, iron deficiency. So if you think about some of those categories, and you think about your role as a healthcare professional, what are some ways that you could address these things, right? Maybe it's, setting up an educational program in a workplace, right? If you happen to be, you could be a nurse, at a company, right? If you're talking about if you're a nurse in a school, right? Again, promoting education to children. If you're particularly focusing on iron deficiency, this probably would be the adolescent population, although I guess not necessarily. Okay, so just kind of think about these things. Think about how, when you're working as a healthcare professional, what are some things that you could do to educate patients, right? Educate the population, and then think about kind of these as preventative sort of mechanisms, right? Okay. If we take a look at this picture here, and again, I think I did add in some extra details in the notes here, right? In terms of looking at these concepts that are related to obesity and physical inactivity, okay? So kind of, if you think about kind of major concept in this chapter, it's the idea of energy balance, right? We're talking about what happens when this sort of goes wrong, right? So energy balance is regulated by food intake, and also an energy expenditure, right? And energy storage. So this is all sort of affected by obesity, right? Or affected by how much food you're taking in, and then how many calories you're burning, essentially, okay? So that this is what this is mentioning, this sort of second sentence here: decrease metabolic rate and decrease physical activity, right? Reduce energy expenditure and increase energy storage, okay? And in the form of adipose tissue, right? So when you think about energy storage, we're talking about, think about in a cell, fat is a molecule that's used as, energy storage, right? Your body can break down fat for energy. So as you're taking in a lot of calories and then not using those calories, right, in the form of physical activity, it's going to get stored in your body, right, as adipose tissue, right, or adipose cells. Those are fat cells, okay? And so, and then the amount of adipose tissue, again, now we're going to kind of think about, and this is what we're going to talk about next, is there are many hormones that are involved in maintaining the adipose tissue, okay? But again, kind of think about that, like simple, what I just talked about in terms of, all right, you're eating a lot, you're not then burning those calories, your body then stores that energy as fat, okay? The way that it actually happens in the body is it's more complex, right? There are many hormones, okay, that are produced in the GI tract that are actually produced by adipose cells, okay, by other endocrine cells, and that are going to be involved in this maintenance of sort of energy homeostasis, okay? And again, if you look down here too, these signals, these endocrine signals that I kind of just mentioned, are then going to be sent to the hypothalamus, right, up to the brain. So the point is, I guess, maintaining sort of the appropriate amount of fat tissue or adipose tissue is a result of many factors, okay? And a lot of them are hormonal, okay? So it's not so simple, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit about this, and you can kind of see how, right, if there's dysfunction in one of these kind of pathways, it could potentially lead to obesity. So it's not as simple as calories in and calories out, right, in terms of maintaining a healthy weight, all right? And so that's what this picture kind of shows too. There are many, many concepts that are related to obesity and physical activity. So I kind of gave you guys some ideas about kind of what we're going to go into next in terms of talking about some of these endocrine molecules, these hormones that help regulate food intake, okay? If we, again, talk about sort of metabolism and sort of this energy homeostasis, or the maintenance of, what's the term I use? Sorry, now I forget the term I use down here, right? Energy balance. If that's not where it should be, then these things that are listed here are a result, right? So you can have changes in cellular regulation, which could lead to cancer, right? Inflammatory changes, which can lead to something like pancreatitis, right? Which is obviously inflammation of the pancreas, but also things like arthritis and other inflammatory types of diseases, okay? Again, if we're talking about this sort of energy balance being thrown off, right? And again, you see that in obesity, it can affect mood and affect, right? Leading to things like depression and just other sort of psychosocial issues, okay? Also can lead to problems in oxygenation, okay? Perfusion, sleep, tissue integrity. And so you can see how all of these are related, okay? So now what we're gonna do next is talk a little bit more about some of these hormonal factors that I sort of been alluding to, okay? One thing I just wanted to kind of put in here, so this is the next learning outcome, right? Etiology of obesity, outline the pathophysiologic consequences, talk about some chronic diseases and metabolic syndrome that are a result of obesity. One other thing I put here is, BMI. We've probably all heard of BMI, and I kind of bring this back at the end of the lecture as well, but, think about this. What's BMI, right? It's weight in kilograms, right? Divided by the square of height in meters. So you can take a second and you can try to calculate your BMI. I think sometimes I ask you guys to kind of pause for a second in class and say, all right, hey, write down your weight, convert it into kilograms, divide it by the square of your height in meters and see what your BMI comes out to, okay? And so, this is one of the major ways we diagnose obesity clinically, right? By BMI, okay? So again, normal range, 18.5 to 24.9, right? Overweight, obese, and then morbidly obese. And so maybe kind of to yourself, calculate this and see where you fit in. And then think about if this is really the best way to sort of assess obesity, right? Or to diagnose obesity. And again, this wouldn't be the only thing that a clinician would use, right? For instance, if you had a lot of muscle mass and you did this calculation, perhaps you would end up in this overweight or obese range when in fact it's not fat, it's muscle, right? Obviously a clinician would be able to sort of tell that, okay? But these are kind of some limitations to using BMI as a diagnostic sort of measure of obesity. Okay, so again, just kind of take a second, maybe think about where your BMI is at, and think if you think that's sort of accurate. Okay, so like I said, what we're going to talk about now is really kind of how is energy homeostasis, right, or energy balance, like I mentioned on that last 2 slides ago, regulated, right? I said it's not just a simple calories in and calories out. There are many molecules, right, in cells that are going to contribute to this maintenance of energy balance, okay? So some of the primary regulators, okay, the brain, right? I mentioned, and we're going to talk more about this, but the hypothalamus, okay? The GI tract, right, and other organ systems are also going to be involved, okay, in energy homeostasis. Adipose tissue or fat tissue itself plays a role, okay? Adipose cells produce certain hormones, and we're going to talk about that, okay? There are also other chemical mediators that will contribute to this as well. So again, understanding that this is a complex process, this energy balance, there are so many things involved, and so therefore makes obesity complex, just like pretty much all diseases that we're going to talk about, okay? Again, what's the sort of purpose of sort of energy homeostasis and these sort of regulators of energy homeostasis, right? They're going to control food intake. They're going to control satiety and also energy expenditure, okay? Because again, they're trying to maintain that sort of proper balance between, breaking down, if you want to just talk about fat, right? In terms of breaking down fat to use for energy or storing it, right? And so this is a complex balance involving a lot of these things here, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about this. And again, guys, this is complex, right? We're going to try to understand some of the mediators and the regions of the body that are involved. We're not going to be able to, describe everything in detail, but I think it's important for us to understand, when we talk about energy homeostasis, right? We understand why that's related to obesity. And we also understand that there are many players in this, okay? And so again, I think I kind of mentioned this on other slide. I made it, I actually had it in the notes, right? But it says here, energy homeostasis. Oh no, this is basically what I had listed on the other slide, okay? So this figure sort of illustrates that, all right? So again, if you look here, what is this showing you? So showing you the GI tract, right? Showing you that the GI tract itself, right, can release certain molecules that act as signals that then can cross the blood-brain barrier and interact or, go to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus in the brain, right? Remember, we talked about the hypothalamus before when we were talking about our, in our stress chapter. The hypothalamus pretty much controls the endocrine system, okay? So controls hormones. It also has centers that help control appetite, right? And so here, satiety, energy expenditure, food intake. These are all processes that are controlled by the hypothalamus. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? But you can see, again, factors that are released by the GI tract, also other chemical mediators coming from other organ systems and other cells will feed into this pathway as well, okay? If you focus now kind of on the adipose tissue, I told you the fat tissue itself will actually secrete molecules, okay? These, again, act as signals that then go to the hypothalamus and affect things like food intake, okay? So you can imagine if there's some sort of dysfunction in these pathways, in one of these pathways or multiple pathways, it could lead to increased food intake. Okay. Again, it's not a simple, right? And it's a physiological issue. Okay. So it's not a simple psychological thing where you just, you say somebody's obese and you say, well, don't eat so much, right? It's way more complex than that. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit more about this, right? So I mentioned hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus, as I said, is the regulating center for appetite, for energy homeostasis. Okay. It receives input from peripheral organs, just like I showed on that last slide, from the GI tract, but from other, peripheral organs as well. It also receives signals from the brainstem, right? Again, other information coming in to the brain, right? If you particularly focus in on the hypothalamus in one particular nucleus, okay? So again, here, the word nucleus, and I have this in the notes here for the slide, but nucleus refers to a group of neurons that basically work together to provide sort of the same function, okay? So within this arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, this region of the hypothalamus is particularly involved in appetite stimulation and appetite depression, depending on which neurons are activated, okay? So if you talk about, or look at this term here, orexigenic, these are appetite stimulating neurons, or orexigenic is appetite stimulating, okay? So that means if these neurons are activated, right, by some of these signals that we're talking about coming into the hypothalamus, then it's going to have a stimulating effect on appetite, okay? If then on the flip side, these appetite depressing neurons or anorexigenic neurons are activated, it will suppress appetite. Okay. And again, how are these neurons activated? Based on the signals that are coming in, right? Say from the adipocytes that we just mentioned, or from the GI tract, whatever signals are secreted, they're going to go and bind to their targets here, whatever they may be. Okay. And they may have a stimulating effect or a depressing effect. Okay. Again, not so simple, right? There are lots of other signals, coming in from the periphery, coming in from other brain regions to the hypothalamus. So things like smell, sight, memories of foods, right? Social context of eating. These are all going to then influence these processes, okay? So meaning these signals will come into the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sort of will evaluate these signals, and that can influence appetite stimulation or appetite depression, okay? Again, if we talk now specifically about what are some hormones that are involved in modulation of these processes, let's look at the next slide, okay? So here, this is just showing you some hormones that are involved. I think I do have some notes here as well, okay? I have some notes here, so take a look at those notes. Says here leptin, okay? So particularly if we're looking here, here's leptin, okay? The way that this, just so you know, kind of the way that this figure is sort of set up and where things are located, it's kind of it's a little weird. So hopefully I can kind of explain it. If you look here, ghrelin is a hormone that's produced in the stomach. I'll mention that in subsequent slides. So for right now, kind of on this figure, I guess we want to just sort of focus on leptin here, okay? And again, kind of looking at the interplay here. So it says here, leptin is adipocyte derived. What does that mean? That means adipocytes will produce leptin, the fat cells themselves, okay? It's then secreted into the bloodstream, right? And it can then go to the hypothalamus, okay? So it says here, provides the brain with information about the amount of adipose tissue and how much energy reserve is in that adipose tissue. Again, remember, fat can be broken down and used for energy, okay? So it's an energy reserve. That's what we mean, okay? So leptin gives the brain this information, right? It says, all right, there's enough fat cells here, right? We don't need to store more, okay? What happens once it goes into the bloodstream, it can bind to receptors, right? In that arcuate nucleus, so that we just talked about right here, this arcuate nucleus, it will bind to receptors there, okay? And when it binds to its receptors in the hypothalamus, it can regulate the release of peptides that are involved in food intake, right? And this is what we're talking about here, right? So it'll either interact, for here, leptin is essentially inhibitory, right? So when it's going to bind to its receptors in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, it will depress, right? It'll potentially be interacting with these anorexigenic neurons, okay? And so you can kind of, again, this is kind of showing you it here. If you follow this up here, it's going up to the hypothalamus, right? And you can see here, it's showing you satiety because hypothalamus is again involved in basically regulating that, okay? Yes, you've eaten enough, you're not hungry anymore, that kind of thing, okay? Also though, if you look here, I wrote this here, leptin also, so if you notice here, there's catecholamines listed here, right? Leptin will also interact with the dopamine system, okay? And it's involved in that reward and motivation of feeding, okay? So leptin is kind of, you can think of leptin, I guess, as when it goes to the hypothalamus, it's sort of acting to depress appetite, okay? And then it also though will play a role in the feeling of kind of the reward of eating, okay? So you can see leptin's a pretty important hormone involved in food intake, involved in feelings of satiety, right? Involved in feeling the reward of eating, okay? And so when you think about this interacting with dopamine, I mean, anything potentially that increases dopamine, in these particular same sort of brain areas could potentially become addictive, right? Because it's going to activate these reward pathways, right? So anyway, that's focusing on leptin here, okay? Now, this is some more sort of information here with leptin, specifically in some of these other mediators that are involved in this pathway, okay? They're showing, it's shown here. And I guess I didn't really go through that. So, all right, let me just see if I want to explain that for a second here. Yeah, so again, if you think, and there's actually another figure in your book, figure 5.5. I left it out because I didn't want you guys to go too crazy with this, but I want to kind of understand. So what I just went through with leptin, we should understand that. Now, again, in some of the other slides, you saw in some of the other pictures, it says other chemical mediators, right? So there are other mediators involved in producing the effects of leptin that I just talked about, okay? So some of these are listed here, okay? And I can kind of, let me just see if I can kind of talk through a little bit in terms of the role here, okay? And this is kind of more of the text, and if you want to read up a little bit more on this is on page 104 of your textbook. So is this figure as well, but some of the text that explains it a little bit more, you can look at that. But so when leptin binds to its receptors, it's involved where you see this here, it shows it inhibits these molecules here. And so these molecules are, I believe that's neuropeptide Y. And AGRP is, let's see if I can say it correctly, a Goody related protein. Okay. So these are actually, decrease kind of by leptin being involved. And then you can see here another kind of part of this pathway here is this POMC. Okay, so POMC is pro-opiomelanocortin. Okay, alpha MSH. Oh, that's not even shown here. Yeah, you know what? Let's not even go there. Okay. So I just want you to understand, again, if you want to read up more about this, you can, but think of these, I guess, as the other mediators that are involved in sort of allowing leptin to produce its effects on food intake. Okay. But what I want you guys to just understand is what I just sort of went through, right? Leptin, goes up to the level of the hypothalamus where it serves as, to suppress, okay, appetite. And I have that pretty much listed in the notes here. Okay. So I guess what I have in the notes is what I'm sort of expecting you guys to take away from this figure. Okay. On the next slide or two, I am going to talk a little bit more about some of these other hormones. Okay. Hopefully that's enough. Let's not even worry about, and again, that's kind of why I left out that figure 5.5 is because I think then we start to get a little too complicated, in terms of looking at some of these sort of signaling pathways. And so let's not even go there. But kind of, I talked about, the orexigenic, right? And the anorexigenic neurons, right? And the effects of leptin. This is zooming in on that a little bit more. So like I said, if you want to know a little bit more, look at figure 5.5. You can read up a little bit more on page 103 to 104. But what I'm going to hold you guys really responsible for is kind of what's written down here. And I will say that, like, on an exam, I could use this diagram, right? And ask you some questions about it. So again, it's not about memorizing or anything like that, but potentially, say, all right, what would happen, say, if leptin wasn't able to bind to its receptor or something like that? It would be kind of questions like that to try to sort of get at mechanism, but not expecting you to memorize, but to be able to reason through, okay? All right, so like I said, the next slide or so mentions some of these other these are GI hormones now, okay? Remember that leptin is produced by the adipocytes, okay? By the actual fat cells, okay? So, and these that are listed here, these are produced in the gastrointestinal tract, okay? So again, it's like I told you, it's complex, right? But I think it's important for us to be aware of some of these particular specific hormones that are involved. And again, to appreciate why obesity isn't just such a simple disease, okay? All right. So if we talk about that first one that's listed there, right? CCK, or I always say this wrong, cholecystokinin, right? Or cholecystokinin, okay? Produced in the duodenum and the small intestine. So again, these are all produced by the GI tract. CCK is released in response to fat and protein, right, being present in the small intestine, okay? And what it does is it stimulates gut motility, stimulates contraction of the gallbladder. Why? The gallbladder releases bile, right? Bile stored in the gallbladder. Bile helps break down fat, okay? Also stimulates sort of the release of pancreatic secretions. Again, what's released? If we talk about like exocrine products of the pancreas, they're digestive enzymes, okay? So the CCK is involved in sort of stimulating or causing the release of those. Why? Because they're needed to break down proteins and fats, okay? And also gastric emptying. So again, think about this. If there is some sort of issue with CCK or your body's not producing enough CCK, all of these things are going to be affected, right? All of these things can contribute to obesity. Or if you are obese and you have that sort of leads to a dysfunction of this, it's going to cause GI issues, okay? Also will bind to receptors in the vagus nerve to basically transfer satiety signals to the hypothalamus. Again, if there is some sort of dysfunction here, maybe you're not getting those satiety signals, right? Leads to overeating. Okay, so even just from this one hormone alone, you can see how it can have really serious effects. Okay, if we talk about another one, glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1, it's produced in the ileum and the colon. It exerts anorexigenic effects. Okay, it says also it amplifies glucose-dependent insulin secretion. So it helps to, when glucose levels rise, it helps to sort of further increase the amount of insulin that's around, right? Why? What's insulin's role? Insulin's role is to bring glucose into the cell, okay? All right, so again, dysfunction in this, it's going to lead to issues in glucose metabolism, right? In glucose getting to the cell, okay? Peptide PYY, produced in the colon in response to food ingestion and the presence of fat. It helps to reduce food intake and appetite, okay? Because it's basically saying, all right, there's fat in the colon here, and it's detecting that and then saying, all right, let's stop. Let's suppress food intake. Let's suppress appetite. Another big one, ghrelin. You may have heard of that, and that actually was in the other figure. It's actually produced in the stomach, and its role is to stimulate appetite. Okay, so if you look at ghrelin levels, they increase right before a meal, and they decrease after meals. Again, if there's a dysfunction in ghrelin, or you don't produce enough of it, okay, or you produce too much of it, right? What's gonna happen? How is that gonna affect food intake? How's that gonna affect energy balance, right? How's that gonna affect fat storage, or the amount of fat that your body has, the amount of fat cells, or the size of those fat cells, essentially. Okay. Adiponectin, another one. This one has a lot of sort of broad effects, many effects. Can lead, some of them, right, can lead to decreased fatty acids, decreased hepatic triglycerides, increased glucose stimulated, that's supposed to be stimulated, let's fix that, insulin secretion. Okay, so again, if you're not producing enough of something like this, you can see how that can contribute to obesity. Okay, all right. Okay, so again, I hope that this, I know this is complex. It is, it is complex, right? There's nothing we can do about that, okay? So I wanted you guys to have know a little bit about this complexity, but again, we're not going to be able to learn every single thing that's going on here, okay? So, no memorizing here. Just sort of being aware here, we were kind of, remember, again, the notes that are written here, we were focusing on sort of leptin and its effects here. In the next couple slides, I mentioned ghrelin and some of the other hormones involved. This down here is specifically, again, focusing on leptin and how leptin exhibits or initiates its effects that we talked about, right? And that's what this is focusing on here. And so these are other mediators that are involved. Okay. Again, if you want to know a little bit more, you can read a little bit more about them, but I'm just going to not even, kind of go there because it's not something we want to memorize. Okay. We should be familiar with these hormones. Again, is it about really memorizing? Probably not. But I think we want to have an idea of kind of like which ones are going to, so for instance, adiponectin, right, is going to lead to decreased fatty acids, right? Decreased adipose tissue. Ghrelin is going to stimulate appetite, okay? Peptide YY reduces food intake, okay? So kind of think about, and I guess we should be, again, familiar with some of the basic functions of these hormones, but even more so about understanding what the effects would be if your body produces too much of one of these or too little, okay? All right, now to move on a little bit here now to talk a little bit more about factors, right? So factors in the etiology and the pathophysiology of obesity, okay? So genetics, right? There have been many studies that have looked at single gene influences on obesity, and you kind of, if you're talking about these sort of single gene defects, these are defects that will lead to severe obesity syndromes, okay? But when we're thinking about more common forms of obesity, it's a result of multiple genes being affected, or this polygenic effect. Okay. Now there have been certain polymorphisms that have been identified. Also epigenetic changes that have been linked to the more common forms of obesity. Okay. So it is not a single gene cause, as you, I'm sure, would imagine, but it is polygenic. It's multiple genes and also epigenetic effects that contribute to obesity. Okay. Again, if we mentioned leptin, we talked a lot about leptin. Leptin was discovered in 1994. If you specifically kind of look at leptin as a genetic target, right? Because again, it's highly studied. There are genetic disorders that are associated with this leptin melanocortin pathway. So that leptin melanocortin pathway is referring to this down here, okay? Because again, these are other mediators that are necessary for leptin to exhibit the effects that we sort of talked about, okay? Remember again here, so let's go back so we kind of understand what's going on here, right? In terms of what's explained here, okay? What happens when leptin binds to its receptors? Well, again, it's not so simple as just leptin binding to its receptor. There are other mediators that are involved, okay? And so leptin indirectly will affect both of these types of neurons here, these orexigenic and also the anorexigenic, okay? So anyway, there have been many studies of that pathway, which is why, there are these sort of detailed, complicated figures showing you a bunch of mediators that are involved in sort of leptin signaling, right? And how leptin exhibits its effects, because it's highly studied, okay? So again, that's that pathway. So apparently there have been, or mutations kind of in the leptin gene or in other, in the genes of those other mediators that I just mentioned, this pathway, in about 1 to 5% of obese people, okay? So it's not a high percentage of obese people. However, the sort of fact that there's so many studies on leptin itself has really given us a lot of information about how body weight is regulated, okay? So just so you kind of understand why there was so much focus kind of on leptin in that other figure, is because we know a lot about it, okay? And so again, we didn't necessarily sort of pinpoint one specific gene that's always mutated in obesity, but it helped us learn a lot about how body weight is regulated, right? And particularly the role of leptin, but also its interactions with all these other mediators that I sort of alluded to. All right. Okay. I mean, again, there's no doubt though that there is a genetic component to obesity, okay? Can we pinpoint one specific gene? No, definitely not. But we know there's a genetic component. There were, in the book actually outlines a couple, or one specific, I think, twin study. And so there have been twin studies that kind of, it looks at, I think, the adopted child versus the biological children. So they're all in the same household, and which ones had obesity. And it does suggest strongly that there's a genetic component. Okay. Sorry about the dog barking in the background. Also, right, inflammation, big factor. So obesity is associated with chronic inflammation. Again, widely studied, but we really don't have a specific mechanism, okay? One of the sort of ideas in terms of how this sort of inflammatory process, or this increase in inflammation, is triggered, right, is that when these adipocytes become lipid laden, meaning they have lots of fat inside, and what happens is they get larger, right? They become hypertrophied. So, and it says in response to increased caloric intake, right? So you see this in an obese patient, right? Decreased energy expenditure. Okay. So again, that leads to these adipocytes to have lots of lipids inside of them and to be really large. Okay. Which then induces cellular stress, right? That then causes those adipocytes and other surrounding cells to produce inflammatory molecules like pro-inflammatory cytokines, okay? And that's sort of believed to kind of trigger that chronic inflammation, okay? Now, these that are listed here, I'm going to talk about on the next slides, okay? So another one, insulin resistance. I feel like we've mentioned this already before, okay? What is insulin resistance? Okay. It's here. Let me actually bold that. Okay. Because we should know what we mean by insulin resistance. Okay. Insulin resistance, bold. It is the inability of insulin to achieve its expected biological response. What is insulin's expected biological response? It's this. Insulin, right? Produced in the pancreas, okay? Released into the bloodstream, binds to the insulin receptors on cells. That then causes the glucose channel to open and allow glucose to enter the cell, okay? That's its expected biological response, okay? When we talk about insulin resistance, it means these cells are not responsive. Well, let's look here. These cells are not responsive to insulin like they should. So there's an issue with the receptor. When insulin binds, maybe it can't bind, right? Or it binds and it doesn't induce opening of these glucose channels. Therefore, glucose can't get into the cell. So that's what we mean by insulin resistance. There's tons of insulin around. And in fact, the body will produce even more insulin when this is going on, right? Because it's trying to decrease blood glucose levels, okay? But it can't, no matter how much insulin is produced. If there's a problem with the receptor, okay, glucose is not going to be able to be brought into the cell, okay? So it says, particularly you find this, right? This insulin resistance is going to occur in adipose tissue, liver, and muscle cells. Okay. So I just went through this, right? You get impaired glucose transport into these target cells, meaning glucose is not able to move from the blood into the cell. Where does glucose, where is it used? In the cell. It gets broken down to basically produce ATP. It serves no role sitting out in the blood, okay? So if there are high levels of glucose in the blood, it indicates some physiological problem, okay? Also, in insulin resistance, you'll see that you get increased secretion of pro-inflammatory mediators released by immune cells, okay? And again, like I said before, your body produces more and more insulin, okay, to try to maintain that normal blood glucose level, okay? But again, usually it will lead to hyperglycemia, right? Increased blood glucose levels, and also can lead to type 2 diabetes, okay? I mentioned this too, but just to kind of throw out a medical term, right? Hyperinsulinemia, that's increased insulin secretion, okay? So increased insulin secretion and insulin resistance, like we're just talking about, are related to obesity. You very often, probably most often, see this in obese patients. Okay. So again, this is affecting energy balance, right? If glucose can't get into the cell, your body's cells are not properly producing energy. They don't have the necessary resources to produce energy, to produce ATP, to maintain normal cellular processes. If normal cellular sort of physiology or metabolism is not maintained, it leads to dysfunction of tissues and then dysfunction of organs, okay? And so you can see how, this type of, or this is showing you normal, but if you have an dysfunction of this process, it's going to affect multiple organs, right? And multiple organ systems, okay? That's why it's so serious. Okay, another thing that is associated with obesity is something called visceral adiposity. So again, this has to do with central fat distribution. So there's an increase in central fat distribution. This contributes to an increased level of LDL, right? Cholesterol, and an increase in LDL versus HDL, right? Bad cholesterol versus good cholesterol puts you at increased risk for heart disease. Okay. Now we could talk more about LDL and HDL, but I think that comes up when we talk about some cardiovascular diseases. So I'll kind of leave it at that. If somebody has a question about LDL and what it is, and we can talk more about it in class. So just bring that up then. Again, also a reminder that we should be taking notes in the exam 2 review sheet. Okay. You should be, again, thinking about these case studies in chapter 5, and we'll talk about one of them in class. I also will assign one of them as well. But remember, keep looking at those, okay? Look at the review questions. Look at in the textbook, there are check your progress questions. Look at those, okay? If you can't answer them, that's probably an issue. Then ask them during class, right? Or go back and read more and figure out the answers. But there are so many tools in the textbook on Moodle that can help you really understand this, okay? But again, make sure if something's not clear that you're asking, okay? Okay, again, having an increase in central fat distribution is obviously going to also increase your total body weight, okay? When you have an increased body weight, that puts your heart, makes your heart have to work harder, right? So increased cardiac workload. That then puts you at risk for cardiomyopathy, which is basically it's just general, right? Disease of the heart muscle. So there are multiple kind of things that can happen to those heart muscle cells, but if they are asked to basically increase their workload all the time, it's going to lead to dysfunction, right? And some sort of disease of the heart muscle can ultimately lead to heart failure, right? If those muscle cells are not functioning correctly. Okay. Another thing that happens as a result of obesity, right, is something called oxidative stress. Okay. So there's something that's called reactive oxygen species. We can abbreviate them as ROS. Okay. So now we're talking about inside the cell, right? And these are reactive, unstable molecules. And these reactive oxygen species will interact with and damage other molecules in the cell. Other molecules like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, DNA, all of which are super important to the function of the cell, okay? So these reactive oxygen species will just interfere with them and interfere with their function, okay? They can impair cell membrane receptors. Again, cell membrane receptors are proteins. So basically any protein, any molecule in the cell is sort of fair game for these reactive oxygen species to damage, okay? Intracellular signaling pathways will be altered as well. And so what do we mean by intracellular signaling pathways? That refers to if something like, say, leptin binds to its receptor on its target cell, it will introduce a whole bunch of intracellular changes within its target cell, okay? And that's basically done or sort of initiated by these different pathways. So there are many molecular signals within the cell that will become activated, okay? What can happen is if there's enough of these reactive oxygen species around, right, and not enough of processes, we're going to talk about this in a second, that can get rid of these reactive oxygen species, it can lead to oxidative stress on that cell, okay? I mean, it could ultimately cause that cell to die. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. It says antioxidant defenses, okay? So your body, your cells normally have processes in place to get rid of these reactive oxygen species, okay? However, if your cells are under increased stress or they're dysfunctional in some way, probably these defense mechanisms are not working properly. That then increases the level of these reactive oxygen species even more, okay? So what do we mean by antioxidant defenses? So you wonder why, it's so important that you get enough vitamins, right? You eat a healthy diet. And you've probably heard the term antioxidants before, okay? So vitamins like E and C are antioxidants. They're also plant flavonoids, right, that are present in bright colored fruits and vegetables. There are also even just normal intracellular enzymes that are present in the body. There's some examples here that get rid of and destroy these reactive oxygen species, okay? So again, obesity affects this, okay? And so you see higher levels of these reactive oxygen species in the cells, which then leads to cellular damage, right? And dysfunction of some of the molecules we just mentioned before. All right. So again, if the cells are under oxidative stress, right, what does it then lead to? Right? Hyperglycemia, increased reactive oxygen species production, even more, okay? Decreased levels of antioxidant defenses, chronic inflammation, increased lipid levels, hyperleptinemia, okay? So all of these are associated with overweight, I guess, and obesity, right? So I guess associated with being overweight or obese, you see all of these happening, okay? So these things all lead to oxidative stress. I guess that's what I meant to say, right? So if you have dysfunction of these antioxidant defense mechanisms, right, that can put you at increased risk for or causing oxidative stress. If you just have an increased production of reactive oxygen species, that can then cause oxidative stress, okay? Chronic inflammation, increased lipid levels, all of these things that are associated with obesity also can lead to oxidative stress, okay? So the idea is, and again, once the cell is under oxidative stress, it is no longer functioning properly. Again, it could also lead to cell death, okay? So the idea of this figure is really showing you that sort of oxidative stress you can think of as a sort of progressive event, okay? It can start in childhood if you're talking about, obesity in childhood, but maybe even some other type of environmental exposure or something like that can increase the levels of reactive oxygen species or what have you, right? An improper diet where then you're decreasing your defense mechanisms, okay? You can get these sort of progressive damage throughout life, okay? And so that's what this is showing you here. So all of these sort of environmental factors, right, can increase the number of reactive oxygen species, okay, which then, right, can damage these cellular molecules, okay? There are repair mechanisms in place, right? Those resident enzymes that I mentioned, and also antioxidants that can help get rid of these reactive oxygen species, okay? But if those don't get rid of enough, it can lead to damage, okay? And so some of the damage that can occur is actually damage to epigenetic molecules, okay? That can then impair function, okay? And like I said, it can lead to death of the cell, okay? Can lead to just age-related diseases because maybe, again, dysfunction of cellular dysfunction, all right? So you can see how this is a progressive effect. And so again, maybe you have these exposures, right? And you have this increasing reactive oxygen species, and then you're adding obesity to the game here, right? It's going to basically just keep adding to the amount of reactive oxygen species and then to oxidative stress that can occur in your cells. Okay, so super important to understand that. All right. Another thing that we see with obesity is metabolic syndrome, okay? So this is another sort of factor in the pathophysiology of obesity, right? So here are some of the hallmarks of metabolic syndrome, some that we talked about already, right? Insulin resistance, increased visceral fat, increased release of free fatty acids, okay? Alterations in peripheral metabolism just in general. In terms of diagnosing metabolic syndrome, okay, there are 5 defining criteria. I'm going to show you another slide in a second. The presence of at least 3 of the 5 will indicate metabolic syndrome, okay? So here again are these defining criteria. 3 out of the 5 will lead to a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome, okay? And you can see some of these defining criteria here. So again, elevated triglyceride levels greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter, elevated blood pressure, elevated fasting glucose, okay? Reduced HDL levels. Remember I said if you have an increase in LDL and a reduction in HDL, it leads to or puts you at increased risk for heart disease. And you see this in obesity a lot, okay? All right. So we're finally near the end here. Let's talk a little bit. I believe this is the last section, kind of the last section or two in this chapter, right? So if you think about some health risks of obesity, okay? And again, I think kind of some of this we've already talked about, but I felt like I kind of needed to reiterate this to kind of lead into what's next. So it says here, obesity is known to increase the risk for many diseases, right? Reduce the quality of life and shorten lifespan, okay? There are functional and psychosocial risks that are introduced as well. Functional meaning you can't get around really well, right? Psychosocial, if you can't get out and do the things that you wanted to do, or, go out with your friends, it's going to lead to social issues as well. Okay. Obesity was defined as a disease only in 2008. Okay. And remember that obesity is associated with the development, again, of many disorders. Type 2 diabetes is the big one, but there are many other systemic and orthopedic disorders as well. And we will talk about some of these, more specifically in later chapters. Okay. If, again, we talk about defining obesity, right, we'll use BMI. And I mentioned BMI already in the beginning of class. Okay. So if you want to kind of think about special populations here. So, right, we're talking about health risks of obesity, particularly if we talk about in childhood and adolescence. Okay. What are the health risks of being obese during adolescence? Cardiovascular disease, right? Insulin resistance. Okay. You see some of the same things as in a normal adult, right? But again, some other kind of specific issues in childhood and adolescence. Probably the bigger one in adolescence is the social and psychological problems that will result from obesity. Okay. Older adulthood, right? Again, greater functional limitations. So when you're in the geriatric population anyway, you're going to have problems with locomotion and things like that. But if you're obese on top of it, it's going to put even greater functional limitations in there. Okay. All right. If you talk about maternal, right, and fetal, neonatal, so these are, again, health risks that are kind of specific to these different populations. For maternal, you can talk about pregnancy-induced hypertension, right, that occurs, and a lot of times that's associated with obesity. Gestational diabetes, okay? Thromboembolism, what's that? Again, remember I in the notes will put definitions for you, right? Thromboembolism, obstruction of a blood vessel, right, by a blood clot, but then it basically was dislodged from another site in circulation, okay? Preterm delivery. If you talk about fetal and neonatal, so being obese as a pregnant woman can lead to issues with the fetus and then the baby that's born, okay? Can lead to miscarriage, can lead to stillbirth, premature delivery, increases in fetal insulin, and also macrosomia, which again is listed here. It's larger than normal size. And in fact, if you even just look at neonatal or I still want to say fetal. I mean, you can think about fetal body weight, right? But even if you just think about the birth weight of a baby, and you look at the relationship, say, between sort of death rate and size, you actually will see that deaths in infants will increase as body size increases to a certain level. Okay. So again, this is an issue. So that larger than normal body size probably is a result, right, of some other metabolic issue that was kind of caused by the obesity of the mother, or the presence, too high levels, right, of glucose than normal. Okay. So that larger size is indicative of some other physiological issue. All right. Again, if you now focus again and talk about excess fat in general, we talked about most of these already. Okay. But these are some other ones, or maybe I'm just reiterating some other ones maybe that we didn't mention. And I'm not going to talk about them in detail. Okay. But let's kind of reiterate and just mention things here again. Type 2 diabetes, big one, right? Dyslipidemias. Okay. So again, this is a dysfunction in terms of, if you talk about dyslipidemia, the levels of lipids in the blood are not normal. Okay. And usually, obviously, higher levels. Metabolic syndrome, we talked about that. There's also something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Okay. And so basically, it's sort of this, you end up with maybe in a large liver. Okay. There's lots of sort of effects, liver effects that this can cause, right? And then obviously dysfunction of the liver. Okay. And so not exactly best situation. Okay, can lead to just endocrine changes in general. Remember, we talked about in the beginning all of these hormones that are related to food intake and energy balance. Okay, so being obese is going to change the levels of those hormones. Okay, and then as you might imagine, those hormones may affect other hormones that are related in other processes as well. Okay, obviously, it also leads to hypertension, right? High blood pressure, heart disease, obstructive sleep apnea, musculoskeletal and skin disorders, gallbladder disease, cancer. There are so many health risks due to the presence of excess fat. Okay, and we talked about some of the mechanisms that happen as a result of having too much fat, right? Or having adipocytes, specifically these fat cells, with too much fat in them, right? What then happens? Okay, here again, if we talk about functional outcomes, we kind of mentioned this already, right? Psychosocial impairments, meaning, the stigmas associated with being obese, right? Depression, again, stereotyping, the idea that like you see somebody who's obese, oh, they just don't, they should be able to control their weight, right? They should just stop eating. I hope you guys appreciate, after listening just to this, that it's much more than that, right? There are so many physiological mechanisms that go into the regulation of food intake, okay? Again, functional limitations, meaning you can't get around. Obviously, as BMI increases, these are going to get worse. We talked about lifespan considerations. So increased BMI is associated with increased mortality, just in general, right? So if you talk about as BMI increases, mortality increases, okay? Affects obese and overweight individuals up to age 75 years. I'm not really sure what I meant by that. So just, I guess, let me get rid of that because I don't know what I was referring to there. Obviously, it was meant to prompt some sort of elaboration, but I'm just going to get rid of it because I think we've talked about everything enough. We already talked kind of about the geriatric population in general, right? And I think that's what that was alluding to. If you talk about, being obese and then getting to an age over 75, you're going to have a lot more functional alterations or functional limitations than that 80-year-old that's not obese. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's sort of what it was alluding to. Okay, if we think about kind of, all right, what are some interventions here, right? Obviously, lifestyles changes, right? Restricting calories, limiting fat intake, obviously increasing physical activity, okay? Increasing consumption of antioxidant-rich foods. Why? We talked about this, right? That's going to combat those reactive oxygen species that lead to cellular dysfunction, okay? There are medications that you can take. I mean, statins are medications that are used to reduce cholesterol levels, okay? There are also many other new weight loss medications that are under investigation and some that are available even, okay? Obviously, other options, surgery, right? Gastric bypass, gastric banding, these are all options as well, okay? Again, remember, this is complex, okay? It's not only about, calories in and calories out, okay? Complex hormonal environment, right? There are so many different mediators involved in just regulating food intake, okay? So again, I hope we appreciate that. So remember, you should be taking notes along with the lecture on your exam 2 review sheet. You should be looking at the questions in the textbook. You should be looking at the the case studies. Hello. And we'll talk about these in class as well. But again, just good idea to take a look at these on your own. All right, guys, thanks.